Tonight, we celebrate the publication of Hasia Diner's new book, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. It's from Yale University Press. It's a beautiful looking book. If you haven't seen it yet, it's on sale in the front area here. And I want to thank Josie from the bookstore. She's going to be selling the books for us. So please, after the panel, you'll be convinced you need your own copy, I'm certain. And Hasia will be happy to, I hope, sign them for you out in our reception area. There, I just signed her up. This evening, we're going to hear from Hasia, and we're going to hear from a panel of scholars who are going to discuss and explore this book. This book, as Professor Hasia Diner puts it, is a story about a mass of ordinary people who in their own ordinariness made history. And these are the Jewish immigrant peddlers that she speaks about. They sold their wares to customers one at a time, and they entered the customer's domestic space to do so. These peddlers propelled a mass migration out of Eastern Europe, out of the Ottoman Empire, and North Africa, with 80% of them coming to the United States. Now, I just started reading this book this afternoon. I'm hooked. I can't put it down. I was telling Hasia, you'll want to read on. You'll want to get your own copy, especially after tonight's panel. I wanted to add that Hasia Diner was a fellow here at the Humanities Initiative, and we're always really happy to have our fellows come back with their books for events after they've been with us as a fellow. Professor Barbara Weinstein is going to moderate our discussion this evening, so I'm going to introduce her very briefly and then turn the evening over to her. Barbara Weinstein is Silver Professor of History and Chair of the History Department here at NYU. Her research has focused on post-colonial Latin America, particularly Brazil. Her publications include For Social Peace in Brazil, Industrialists and the Remaking of the Working Class in São Paulo, 1920 to 1964. That was from University of North Carolina Press in 1996. The Amazon Rubber Boom, 1850 to 1920. That's from Stanford in 1983, and that's actually in the acknowledgement of this book, so very relevant. And she has a new book that just came out from 2015 from Duke. It's called The Color of Modernity, São Paulo and the Making of Race and Nation in Brazil. Her fellowships include awards from the Fulbright Hays Program, the Guggenheim Memorial. Hi, come on in. Great. He's here. And the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're very pleased to have her here with us tonight and to introduce the panelists and to moderate the discussion. Thank you, Barbara. It's to you.
Thank you, Gwen. I'm actually a little sorry that Andrew arrived because I was sort of thinking of doing a completely fictional introduction of him when he wasn't here, and he would never know, give a different name to his book and everything. Now I'll actually have to be accurate. But, so I'm delighted to be moderating this session this evening, and I will first just introduce all three people on the panel, just say a few very brief words, and then I will turn it over to Nancy and Andrew, and then Hasia will speak last. So Nancy Sinkoff, we're very pleased to have her here with us this evening. She's Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Rutgers University, and she is the director of the Center for European Studies. Is that still true? Whenever I take something off the internet, I'm always worried that so you have to update your bio. You're still talking about your forthcoming book. And she is the author of Out of the Shtetl, Making Jews Modern in the Polish Borderlands, and many articles in journals and magazines, both for scholarly and more popular consumption. Andrew Needham is Associate Professor of History at NYU. He is the author of Power Lines, Phoenix and the Making of the Modern Southwest, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2014, and the author of several articles about related to environmental history and urban history, particularly in the Sun Belt. Finally, our guest of honor and our author tonight is Hasia Diner, who is Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and History and the Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History. She is the author of many more books than I could mention. I have to say that, most people know that historians take a long time to finish books. At least I take a long time to finish books. But Hasia's production, book and article-wise and anthology-wise, is really quite remarkable. I would like to just mention a few of the titles of her books, sort of going backwards in time. We remember with reverence and love American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962, which was published in 2009 by NYU Press and was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award. She is also the co-author of From Arrival to Incorporation, Migrants to the U.S. in a Global Age, which was 2007. I'm going to skip some now. Hungering for America, Italian, Irish, and Jewish Foodways in the Age of Migration, which was Harvard University Press, 2002. And then I'm going to go back to, so people know that it's not only is Hasia a major scholar in the field of Jewish history, but also the more broadly configured sort of field of it within U.S. history of immigration history. And her books include, where did it go? Gosh, Erin's Daughters in America, Irish Immigrant Women in the 19th Century, which was published in 1984 by Johns Hopkins University Press. There are many that I skipped, let me say. Hasia has received many fellowships and prizes over the years, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, and she is a very valued colleague for all of us here at NYU, and I am delighted tonight that we can celebrate the publication of her new book, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. There's the cover if you haven't already seen it. And I would just like to start off by just saying a few words that refer to my own work, but I promise it'll be very short, which is that in 1976, when I started in earnest the research for what would become my doctoral dissertation, which was on the rubber boom in the Amazon, I started doing research in the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs because I assumed that many of the rubber traders and merchants in the Amazon were going to be foreigners, probably the British, French, from the US, and that I would find documentation about them there, and that I would find it mainly during the period of the boom itself, which is generally seen as starting in the 1890s with the bicycle craze and then really taking off in the early 1900s with the rise of the automobile. But I went back and started looking at documentation around the mid-19th century, well before the boom occurred, but when rubber was already being traded. And to my total astonishment, I kept coming across documentation about people with names like Simon ben Shimol, Moises Cohen, names that were obviously Jewish, and in most cases, I think in all cases, Sephardic. And documentation from Tangiers, from Morocco in general. And for the first time, it became clear to me that many of the earliest people involved in rubber trading were peddlers, were, as people called them, mascates, regatistas in Portuguese, but in English accounts referred to them as Hebrew peddlers. And it was really a revelation for me because of course I was aware as somebody myself from a Russian Jewish background. I was aware of the phenomenon of the Jewish peddler, but I had no idea about the reach and dispersion of peddlers throughout the world, and particularly in a part of Latin America that was, of course, required a great deal of chutzpah to penetrate. I mean, this was really not an easy terrain for anyone, including even the people who were from that region to navigate and to be economically productive in. And so it was really quite astonishing to me to discover not only that they were there, but they were there many decades before the actual rubber boom. And so it wasn't simply that there was suddenly this boom in prosperity and then they showed up, but rather they showed up long before their rubber had become sort of what they called black gold. And so this was really, I have to say, I found it almost moving to, think about their presence in the Amazon and what this must have meant to them. And to this day, I recently went to a conference in a rather remote city in the Amazon, Macapá, and one of the bridges is named after a man named Eliezer Levi, who was an important politician in various Amazonian cities and was mayor of Macapá. And there are various things named after Eliezer Levi, who's a descendant of peddlers in the Amazon. So, their traces are really everywhere. And so I was so eager to read Hasia's book, and it is incredibly rewarding, and I sort of strongly recommend it to all of you. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Nancy.
So I'm going to start with the very happy but somewhat obligatory, but not really, thanks for inviting me. But also I wanted to say something about Hasia, because coming back here, I first met Hasia 19 years ago. I was a postdoctoral fellow at NYU, and she was newly appointed in the chair she holds. And I remember thinking, who is she? Because I had moved from U.S. history to early modern Polish history, and in my continued search for understanding the varieties of East European Jewish political culture, which remains my obsession. And as a cultural intellectual historian, her work was not on my radar. But it is now, not only because cultural intellectual historians like myself can't really move without the work of social historians who provide the lived reality for the ideas that Jews shape, but also because I now frequently teach U.S. Jewish history. And as Barbara Weinstein mentioned, you put your finger down and you're going to come up with a book that Hasia wrote, and her work is just indispensable. And so I'm very grateful to her scholarship. I'm grateful to her collegiality over all these years. Tonight, I'm going to start with some historiographic observations and then discuss how Roads Taken contributes to the writing of modern Jewish history. And then I'll return to some questions that the book raised for me. And again, just remember, I come at this as someone really interested in Jewish culture and Jewish intellectual life, and not as a social historian. So I hope I'm adding to ways to think about the book, even though I come at from a different methodological concerns, I guess. So I'm going to start, true to form, with literary text, right? A certain Jewish peddler was traveling with his stock from town to town and village to village. One day he found himself in a wooded region far from any settlement. He saw a lone house. He approached it, and standing before the door, he cried out his wares. A lady came outside and spoke to him. "What do you want here, Jew?" Bowing, he wished her well and said, "Perhaps you can use something of these lovely things I have." He took his pack off his back and offered her all sorts of goods. "I have no use for you or your wares," she said to him. "But look and see, perhaps even so. Here are ribbons and rings and kerchiefs and sheets and soap and fine perfumes that the noble women use." She looked at his pack for a few moments, then averted her eyes from him. "There's nothing here, get out." Again, he bowed before her and took things out of his pack to offer to her. "Just look, my lady, and don't say there's nothing here. Perhaps you might want this, or perhaps this lovely piece of goods pleases you. Please, my lady, look and see." The lady saw a hunting knife. She paid him for it and went back into her house. He put his pack on his shoulders and he went on his way, unquote. So entered the figure of the Jewish peddler in modern Hebrew literature in the story The Lady and the Peddler, Ha'adonit ve'Rochel. Penned by Shai Agnon in 1951, this story, which goes on to become a Gothic tale in which the noble woman becomes transfigured into a vampire-like figure, has been read as an allegory of Judaism and Christianity in European society. The story starts out innocently enough with the typical exchange of the male Jewish peddler with his customer, often a non-Jewish woman, and yet devolves into a nightmare of Jewish-Christian tension. This tension shaped Agnon's magisterial literary imagination and affirmed, for many students of Jewish history, the fundamental structure of Jewish life in the Old World, which they saw as characterized by anti-Jewish animus. They then interpreted anti-Jewish violence and sentiment as the primary cause for the massive emigration of Jews from Europe, which began already in the late 18th century and continued well into the 20th, although with starts and fits due to legal restrictions. I start with Agnon's story, because I like it, but also because it is a countertext to Hasia Diner's book, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. Roads Taken focuses on New World Jewish-Gentile economic relations and thus challenges the causality of the major shifts in Jewish geography by focusing on the millions of plucky Jewish men who, choosing to leave Europe from the end of the 18th century up until the interwar years, helped to transform modern Jewish history. Her new book, like so many of her other books, is a work of social history. Hasia is interested in the Jews as a group in history and in how they function in the world economically, socially, politically, and culturally. Most of her work, not all of it, but most of her work is focused on the United States. This book reaches globally, but the U.S. is still her primary locus of attention because 80% of Jewish peddlers carried their packs on American soil. The book fits into a category that David Hollinger has termed dispersionist history in a symposium that Hasia participated on about the neglect that American Jewish historiography plays in American historiography. He concluded that dispersionist historians focus on Jewishness broadly defined of individuals, even to the inclusion of those Jews who exit any formal or personal affiliation with the Jewish community, and the way it has informed American history, such as the undeniable concentration of Jews in media, liberal politics, academics, and other middle-class professions. He juxtaposed dispersionist historians to communalist historians, charging the latter from writing from, quote, the perspective of Jewish community and its concerns with communal cohesion and continuity, which he blamed for rendering their work invisible to U.S. historians. Hasia soundly showed him why there are other reasons why American Jewish historians' work has been ignored. She can speak for herself, but I think it's very compelling, and I think this book is, among other things, a joust to why American historians, global historians, should pay attention to Jews. Road-taking is Hasia Diner's heavy-lifting response to restore the economic activity of Jewish peddlers, which had global import into the narrative of early capitalism, colonialism, migration, Jewish social and economic mobility, American and Jewish communal history. She hopes, as we all do, that this book, transnational in reach and focusing on the central role that peddling as an economic force played in the development of New World economics, will be read and digested by historians of the U.S., South Africa, South and Central America, Canada, Wales, Ireland, and New Zealand. If those national historians take the history of nascent consumer capitalism seriously, then we hope they will take seriously the roles of Jews in that history. Roads Taken directly confronts the biases of the term social history, which has so dominated American historical writing since the late 60s. Social historians, motivated by New Left politics and the desire to make historical narratives more inclusive because they believed that history writing could transform society, turned to the history of the disenfranchised. This meant focusing on those groups who'd fallen out of the general narratives that had focused on great men in history and their impact on politics. Social historians revolutionized the writing of history by zeroing in on the lives of women, African Americans, and other minorities, the working class and the laboring poor, and changed the definition of legitimate sources. They no longer focused exclusively on literary or written text, instead scouring legal documents, oral histories, private letters, police records, and much more. Historians of the Jews were also motivated to redress what they saw as an imbalance in their field, which had written the Jewish past primarily through religious and intellectual texts. Social historians of the Jews turned their sights on Jewish women, the Jewish poor, the Jewish working classes, and the economic life of the Jews, although primarily on the work life of oppressed or exploited Jews. The interest in non-Ashkenazic Jewries also grew out of this historiographic shift. But it became increasingly challenging to social historians of the Jews to fit Jews into the rather stubborn parameters of American social history that continue to focus on the underprivileged or oppressed. Jewish proletarian bona fides ran out after 2 generations, as the social mobility of these peddlers show. That there was long a reluctance to examine the social history of the Jewish middle class, accepting, and this is very important, the ways in which Jewish women helped shape the formation of the German middle class in the 19th century. Marion Kaplan has done that obviously so wonderfully. Middle-class success made and makes many American historians uncomfortable. Thus, Roads Taken may be seen, Hasia, forgive me here, as your rapprochement with the Jewish petty bourgeoisie. And if you ask me later, I'll tell you there's another historian with whom I don't think you share many things, but you share also this interest in the Jewish petty bourgeoisie. We'll talk about it. I don't want to talk too much about my work, but there's a hint there. Roads Taken takes as its subject the social history of the petty Jewish middle classes, restoring the historical agency of its actors, and does so unapologetically and with great historical compassion. The book can be seen as part of a recent or sort of recent economic turn in Jewish historical writing, begun in part by Jonathan Israel's European Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism, 1550 to 1750, which focused on the role that mercantile capitalism played in the shift in migration patterns of European Jewry westward in the 16th to 18th centuries. Israel, however, focused on rather high-end economic activity. Petty trade was a problem for European states, which from the end of the early modern period sought to reform the Jews' economic profile, from legislation against Betteljuden beggars to the crisis of receipts in Alsace to the rhetoric of the Enlightenment. The brave Jewish men who left Europe and their willingness to engage in peddling, a form of petty trading, illustrated that this economic behavior was actually an asset. Roads Taken is about the nexus between Jews, economic opportunity, and migration, as, in Hasia's words, an economic strategy. She documents the ways in which peddling had far-reaching implications for Jewish life globally and shifted the geography of Jewish life. It shares with Sarah Stein's Plumes, Ostrich Feathers, Jews in a Lost World of Global Commerce, a commitment to the dispassionate examination of Jews in global trade. Roads Taken affirms a shift among historians of the Jews away from a fear of economic anti-Semitism, which was noted by Derek Penslar in a book entitled Shylock's Children, Economics and Jewish Identity in Modern Europe. Because economic anti-Semitism played such a central role in National Socialism, and also with the odd bedfellow of the trope of the Jew as communist and the Jew as entrepreneur in Soviet society, along with the elders of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent, this fear of economic anti-Semitism made historians reluctant to examine the role that Jews played in early capitalism and in petty trading. Hasia's book insists on the importance of peddling as a Jewish economic strategy, but she does not do so in the spirit of consensus triumphalism that marked earlier generations of historians of American Jews, who touched on peddling as they focused on Jewish economic mobility. Roads Taken de-emphasizes social class and ethnic conflict, while recognizing where it existed in the lives of the peddlers, and it does not trumpet, the book does not trumpet American exceptionalism. The success of the peddlers in this book was not innate, but due to a host of historically conditioned circumstances. They were in the right place at the right time, had the right gender, and the right complexion, and they were willing to work hard. Roads Taken replaces American exceptionalism, justly I believe, with an acknowledgement of American distinctiveness. And I think this is an important shift terminologically, and I think it's critically actually important for the history of modern Jews. Peddlers who came to these shores, and as noted, over 80% did, encountered a society that differed fundamentally from the European Old World and from the other societies in which peddlers plied their goods. There was no Jewish problem in the United States. Jewish men, as Hasia points out, were enfranchised politically upon arrival after the 1790s. Racially coded as white, they could and did take full advantage of their ability to be American, to haul a 150-pound pack on their backs, grab the reins of a horse or mule, and set out to capitalize in the New World with few barriers to their economic mobility and, in turn, to their social mobility. Roads Taken is a story of a highly successful immigration. Unlike Agnon's peddler, Jewish men in the United States, while fully cognizant of their Jewish difference, did not internalize that difference as an economic or social obstacle. Roads Taken, despite the chapter on road rage, which details the violence, loneliness, and isolation encountered by peddlers, is largely a harmonious history. The book lacks social class conflict or much conflict at all, emphasizing instead mutuality among Jews through mutually beneficial kinship, economic and communal networks, and between Jews and Gentiles, Jewish male peddlers and their Gentile female customers. The capitalism in Roads Taken is largely unexploitative, although Hasia does not shy away from the ways in which Jewish peddlers participated in the economy of plantation slavery in the U.S. Yet she notes that Jewish peddlers were often the first whites to deal fairly with enslaved African Americans, recognizing their human desire for domestic goods. Because of the harmonious analysis and tone of Roads Taken, I found problematic Hasia's use of the term entrepreneurial proletariat to describe the peddlers. A proletariat, as Marx taught us, is someone who sells his or her labor power, and in so doing denies his or her species being, that which makes them human. But as the book shows so well, these peddlers did not sell their labor power. In fact, controlling when, where, and how they worked was central to their labor. Keeping a 5-day week was a luxury, as Hasia notes, compared to other Americans' schedule. And even if they worked on Sunday, those Jewish peddlers who cared about the Sabbath were able to observe it within their home communities. They did not deny their species being. In fact, Hasia shows that their aspirations for geographic mobility, economic freedom, and communal choice were largely met. Those who wished to give up the demands of the peddling life, and most did after a decade, did so out of choice, and with the ability to create sedentary middle-class occupations that drew from their peddling experience. They established fulfilling economic lives for themselves that in turn became the foundation of Jewish communities in the New World. Their consciousness shared less with classical proletarians than with the producer consciousness of the men of the Knights of Labor, a kind of Republican producerism that embraced the values of liberalism, entrepreneurship, and free labor, and embraced the virtuous character of economic mobility. We might then ask, how did the successful sedentary peddlers react to the proletarian consciousness of later generations of Jewish immigrants, who, while they too may have peddled, articulated the class war discourse of socialism? How did the rags to riches success of Jewish peddlers in the United States jibe with the welfare state liberalism of the 1930s? How did the historical social mobility of Jewish immigrants nurture the embrace of capitalism articulated by Jewish neoconservatives in the late 60s? Those are just some questions to think about. Another issue that Rhodes Taken suggested to me is terminological. Global seems to have replaced diasporic. This lexical turn seems to me part of the effort of social historians like Hasia, and I understand it and respect it, to encourage her Americanist peers to pay attention to the history of the Jews. Diaspora, although a neutral term that is still deployed among literary critics, may still bear the stigma of its Jewish theological origins. Yet it can still be fruitful for Hasia's peddlers because their global peregrinations did not render their diasporic status invisible. They felt and knew that they were Jews, voluntary exiles from the European heartland, and bound to other Jews because of an earlier experience of exile. Historians may be imposing the vocabulary of global onto them, when the peddlers themselves may have felt part of the Jewish diaspora. Sensitivity to gender as a category of historical analysis has always been central to Hasia's work. I just want to note, I know I'm taking time, but the work is very stimulating. When you read Hasia's work and she quotes from a historical actor, I always think to myself, she's making a very conscious choice. She's deciding whether or not she wants to quote from a man or quote from a woman. And she's going to make sure that she includes women without a lot of fanfare, but just as historical actors. And I always appreciate that, and I always notice that. So take a look at her history of the United States. It's really just wonderful how she does that. So gender, and she announces that, this in the introduction, is critically important to her work, always has been. Rhodes Taken, though, has male protagonists, and she's very careful to mark how gender shaped the global foot peddler. Peddling was indeed mostly a male business. When women enter the narrative, they do so as customers, primarily Gentiles, or as potential brides and then wives left behind during the week. When the peddler settled down economically, his wife could become more active in their economic life. But Hasia is attuned to the ways in which women's agency could be affected through the private budgets that they managed in their households, and how Gentile farm women often interacted with the peddler without their husbands knowing. But for me, Rhodes Taken asks a different gender question. The Christian polemic about Jewish involvement with trade and commerce, which riddles even the most philo-Semitic tracts urging toleration of the Jews, was absorbed by Jewish intellectuals in the late 18th century and led to, among other pathways, a critique of the, quote, Baroque culture of Ashkenazic Jewry that focused on the unproductiveness of male Jewish economic life. Enlightened Jews, dismayed by the concentration of Jews in trade and their seeming unfitness for entry into European economic life, because their focus on Talmudic education at the expense of secular studies had resulted in an utter lack of marketable skills, urged the productivization of male Jews, to train them to become agriculturalists and laborers. This economic critique created an impugned and distorted image of Jewish maleness, and this has a long history. A Talmudic scholar and his commercially oriented brother were not real men. But what of our peddlers, who logged hundreds of miles in the dense forests of upstate New York, along the hot roads of the South and the West, among plantations and mining camps in South Africa, in the jungles of South America, with packs on their back double their weight and more so? In spite of their bowler hats, they must have been extraordinarily fit. How, if at all, did the contemporaneous Jewish intelligentsia take these men's maleness into consideration? How did they, if they did, later shape the image of the male Jew in their construction of New World Jewish modernity? Asking these questions sheds light not on the masculinity of the peddlers themselves, but on the construct of Jewish maleness created by Jewish ideologues, from the Maskilim, the enlightened Jews, through Jewish nationalists and well into the communist period, which glorified the agricultural and industrial proletariat against the predations and fecklessness of the bourgeoisie. The contradiction between image and reality was driven home to me by Hasia's discussion of Litvak peddlers. Generally, when historians of the Jews invoke Lithuania, they do so as a seat of rabbinic learning, resistant to the appeal of Hasidic enthusiasm, and personified by the iconic figure of the Gaon of Vilna. But Rhodes Taken suggests that when historians of modern Jews think about Lithuanian Jewry, they might better think of the scores of Lithuanian Jews who left the northern Polish borderlands to peddle in South Africa. My last comment has to do, or my last-ish comment, has to do with the emphasis on migration as a motor force of the changes in Jewish life narrated by the book. Perhaps this is a chicken and egg comment, so go after me later. But I'm not sure if we should emphasize migration as the catalyst for this great historical shift out of Europe, or of the changing economy itself in which a migrating peddler could fit and succeed. What struck me over and over again was the prescience and courage of these Jewish peddlers, and of the happenstance, luck, and the distinctness, in the American case, of economic opportunity that led so many young Jewish men to cross the ocean. We must ask, why did Jews as a group take advantage of the opportunities in the New World? How can we explain the willingness of these Jewish peddlers to be enticed by the new economy? What was it about the flexibility, independence, familiarity with trade that made peddling, despite its arduous labor, so enticing? How, then, did the medieval and early modern experience of Jews with trade and commerce abet their willingness to peddle, to be involved with credit associations, pledging, and pawning? I'm suggesting here more continuity between New World peddling and Old World Jewish economic activity. The economy changed, benefiting Jewish economic skills, and migration was the means for Jews to take advantage of those changes. The peddlers' migration out of Europe was crucial in reshaping modern Jewish history. But what was crucial about it, to my mind, was not merely their migration, but the locales to where they migrated. Leaving the European heartland was not just about geography. It was about leaving the fundamental structures that shaped and formed Jewishness in the crucible of the religious, political, and economic history of medieval and early modern Christendom, West and East. You will recall that some of Hasia's peddlers, well, if you've read the book, carried Christian iconography in their packs with seemingly no fear of being charged with host desecration or blood libel that haunted Jewish life in Old World Europe, a fear that shrouds the Agnon story with which I began. They did not know then what we know now, that 80% of the peddlers who left Europe for the United States would go on to form what would become the most important Jewish community in the world by the second half of the 20th century. Their migration to the U.S. arguably saved the Jewish people when the European heartland was destroyed. With our knowledge, of course, and nod to the African, South American, Canadian, South American communities. I'm not minimizing them, but still, the U.S. is indisputably the home of all of these peddlers. Hasia concluded that the peddlers left a world a different place from one they found, changed themselves, and made those places and Jewish history modern. Maybe this is the peddler's cart before the horse. The economy was modernizing, and Jewish peddlers, taking advantage of the ways in which they could succeed in the new economy, actively fueled the economic engine of modernity and changed Jewish geography. Because so many of them ended up in the U.S., they fundamentally altered the structure of modern Jewish communal existence, now in sync with the distinctive separation of this country between church and state, access to religious freedom, economic opportunity, communal volunteerism that characterizes modern Jewish life. I was struck by the temporal aspect of Hasia's study. She could write about Jewish peddlers as part of the social history of the Jews because until her terminus in the 1920s, and for one or more generations perhaps, it was clear what a Jew was and how his Jewishness shaped his economic choices. He knew he was a Jew. His customers knew he was a Jew. He was a Jew because of his Europeanness and because of what he did for a living. A social historian like Hasia could find him everywhere she looked, and she looked far and wide. But I can't help but wonder if the social history of Jewish economic behavior can still be written. Do Jews still fit into an ethnic economic niche? It strikes me that particularly in the openness of the U.S. that allowed mobility for white men, taking Hasia's story into the later decades of the 20th century will be much more difficult. Hasia could write dispersion as social history of Jewish peddlers because the Jewish identity, the Jewishness of her subjects was clear, historically fixed. What happens when it's not? So, I started out with Agnon, whose story invoked the deep fears of a Hebrew writer from Christian Europe in order to contrast it with the fearless protagonists of Roads Taken. These peddlers' stories, so clearly rendered in this book, tells of the unusual opportunity that global and particularly American capitalism offered to male Jewish migrants during the long 19th century. The book should grab the attention of American historians of capitalism, migration, ethnic economies, and modern Jewish historians, both social and cultural intellectual. Academics who inhabit a bourgeois profession have chosen to labor in their profession for some of the same reasons the peddlers chose to put packs on their backs: independence, autonomy, little contact with any kind of real boss, and flexibility to make one's own schedule. Their wares are not table linens, watches, or pots and pans, but ideas. Yet they function in an increasingly consumerist setting. Hasia Diner's peddlers, so vividly and humanly rendered in Roads Taken, undoubtedly have something to teach them. Thank you very much.
Whenever I talked to Hasia during the process when she was writing this book, I would always come away from those conversations thinking about things that I had never thought of before, and the experience of reading the book was really for me that kind of times 100. At first glance, this seems kind of a modest book about a particular figure, right? The Jewish peddler, a kind of idiosyncratic kind of figure within the history of economic life. But on deeper examination, this is a book I think that really tells the story about how these peddlers help drive really dramatic cultural changes in the way that people experience capitalism. And I'm going to come back to experience several times. And in the way that people related to that emerging cultural world of retail capitalism that in many senses was being brought to them by the peddlers that are the subject of this book. And so I'm going to talk in brief detail about kind of the ways that I think Hasia's book really wonderfully and importantly challenges some of the stories about the ways that the history of capitalism is written right now. So as some of you may be aware, a couple years ago there was an article was it on the front page of the New York Times? Yeah. About the history of capitalism? And it began, a specter is haunting university history departments, the specter of capitalism. After decades of history from below, focusing on women, minorities, and other marginalized people seizing their destiny, a new generation of scholars is increasingly turning to what, strangely, risked becoming the most marginalized group of all, the bosses, bankers, and brokers who run the economy. The article went on from there to kind of run through a series of what are very good histories and very interesting history, but are largely and dominantly histories of finance, the development of finance, and the development of commodity capitalism. That really, said, well, the story of the history of capitalism that we need to pay attention to is the history of the creation and the financial maintenance of the industrial and post-industrial world, driven by, these bosses, bankers, and brokers who run the economy. And I think, Hasia's book, in a way, torpedoes that portrait of the history of capitalism very, very effectively. There's probably a better metaphor than torpedoes there, but I can't think of it right now. I think her book really shows that this is that kind of that précis for the idea of the history of capitalism is fundamentally limited, and a limited way of telling that history. Left out from that history are the way that people, particularly those people that live far from metropolitan centers, came to experience the new world of mass production that reorganized the globe in the period from the 18th century, to the early 20th century. And this is really where Hasia's book comes in and demands, attention for how this worked, who drove these changes, who physically drove these changes, and what the experience of commercial and retail capitalism was like, that was forged in this, in the world made by these Jewish peddlers. In Hasia's book, there are some familiar aspects of, that I think the New York Times reporter would recognize, in the history of capitalism, that I can't remember if it was a he or a she was promoting. There are, global credit networks kind of stretching across oceans in the book. There's industrial manufacturing, that's creating a wealth of new goods that can be, consumed by masses of people around the world. But Hasia's book shows that capitalism is not just formed in boardrooms and in trade flows. It's also literally formed on the backs and the difficult physical labor of men walking through the cold and the heat. And I write in my book a little bit about Barry Goldwater, and Barry Goldwater's grandfather is one of the subjects that shows up in Hasia's book, and he's peddling in Gila City, Arizona, which must have been it's just impossible for me to conceptualize what it meant to carry, an 80-pound pack in, 110-degree weather, or, there are, people peddling in the Mesabi Iron Range, in the Keweenaw Peninsula of, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the dead of winter, right? These are difficult physical, this is an activity that taxes not only kind of credit networks, but physically taxes the body. There's a kind of bodily history of retail capitalism that I think we're unfamiliar with, right? And thinking of what is the bodily experience of retail capitalism like, whether it's carrying a pack, on a circuit or standing on your feet, I think it raises a whole set of questions about, the history of the body and the history of retail capitalism. It also, I think, one of the most fascinating things that I took away from Hasia's book is these experiential connections between the peddlers and their consumers, and the way that this form of retail capitalism created new experiences for people. That peddlers, in a way, created a set of new experiences of consumption and capitalism itself for people. It was experiences that happened intimately in people's homes, from peddlers who came through not randomly, but on a regular schedule that would become kind of known and recognized, become parts of people's daily and weekly experience, by merchants who would at times, for particularly generous customers, sleep in their homes, eat or not eat their food, as the case may be. And I think one of the really fascinating sections of this book is the intersection of rural American diets and Jewish dietary laws, and how kind of people made sense of those two worlds coming together. So I think that's the second experience. If the first is the intimate experience of commercial capitalism coming into someone's home, the second is that people experienced a diversity of these goods in the cosmopolitan commercial economy. At the same time, they experienced a diversity of cosmopolitan life, really. Peddlers taught consumers not only that there was a range of products that could be brought to their houses, but they taught them that there were different ways of being, different ways of speaking, different ways of praying. And there are, again, wonderful stories, in the book about, Gentiles observing the peddlers praying in the morning and being like, "Oh God, he's trying to kill himself. What's going on?" And so there's a way in which, there's an experience of difference that comes in, as a central part of this story. There's a deep experience of pleasure in this book, the pleasure of new goods, the pleasure of having someone bring those goods to you, the pleasure of having someone predict your needs. In a way, the peddlers are the forerunners of the Amazon algorithm. Right? If you like this ribbon, if you like this tablecloth, you might like these napkins. And it allowed consumers to realize often unusual and unaccustomed power. And in particular, it allowed women to realize new forms of kind of power in the household and power to shape household spending economies. And it shaped really deeply, I think, and importantly, in ways that I had never thought about, kind of the way that kind of African American commercial power that these peddlers provided ways around the kind of the harsh world of Jim Crow as it was put in place in the late 19th and early 20th century, both in kind of opening up a commercial world and in opening up a world of respect. Another of my favorite parts of the book is when one peddler instructs another that, to when you enter an African American house in the South, to remove your hat, to address to address the people there as sir and ma'am, and to create a notion to provide respect to people who very rarely received respect. And this is obviously, helps you sell goods. But it also, provides something else. I mean, I think there's a really important, story here about the internal pleasures that consumption brings, that are not only about goods, but are about, the way that people create a sense of who they are through what they buy and who they buy it from, right? This is the kind of beginning of the shopkeeper who, and the retailer who creates not only economic connection, but also emotional connection with the customers. And so this was, a really powerful way that these kind of experiences could work against, I think, hierarchies of race, gender, and at times class in really powerful and effective ways. I have a few, questions that I'd love to hear Hasia talk about, in many ways, the peddlers served as the introduction of the cash economy into a whole world of barter. And whether money served as a leveler or kind of how we should think about kind of money in this world. How the money, I'd be interested in hearing kind of the flow of money kind of backwards. But I think, in general, what I'd like to just kind of leave people thinking about is the way that capitalism was forged in broad global webs, not just of the flow of credit and commodities, not only in places like, Manchester, but in the flow of people across space, which is what really one of the kind of central things that and important, valuable things that I took away from the book.
Thank you. So I actually had a real plan in terms of the three interlocutors, as it were, that I invited. So in fact, when Barbara first came to NYU, and I think we had a breakfast for graduate students, and everybody was supposed to get up and say something about what they were working on, and I said I was working on this project of Peddlers, and you came up to me and you mentioned your Amazon.
The other Amazon, the real
Amazon. And it's, it must have been like a 1 minute exchange, but I thought, this is not going to be just an American project.
Yeah.
And I said, it's just too rich to go beyond, to limit it. Although obviously numerically I could have, and if I had just told it as an American history, I think it would still have been a big story. But it was that, and you use the word global, and why not diasporic? And you in a sense convinced me in that very brief encounter about the importance of thinking in global terms and asking questions about the differences between one kind of place and another, and how different or how similar was this experience if it took place in the Amazon or if it took place in New Jersey. So, and I thought in a sense I couldn't answer what was distinctively American if I didn't put it in that context. And those people here who are my students know I'm always pushing that kind of comparative dimension. And so I felt really obliged because of you to do it. And so I asked Nancy, because I think of Nancy as really very important player in modern Jewish history, and the fact that she comes to it from intellectual history seemed to me a very important, I would say, not so much an antidote to this social history, but to helping to erase the differences between social and intellectual history. And because I was so interested in how Jewish intellectuals hated the peddlers and were constantly writing about how to train them to become something else. And obviously, so much of the discourse of modern Jewish history has been about the pathology of Jews because of peddling. And so I really was very eager to hear how an intellectual historian would engage with it. And Andrew is our environmental historian, an Americanist, and here these were, while I don't think I used the word environmental history ever, but yet these were people on the land, physically, literally, in Gila, Arizona, or Tupper Lake, New York, which I'll talk about in a second, or wherever. And I think that Jewish history has, in fact, not paid enough attention to the kind of physicality of space and the way in which the physical environment shapes the kinds of experiences that
Well, it has now.
Yeah, so I really was it was very deliberate, and I really so appreciate all of you, all three of you, doing this. So let me just say 2-3 short things that I want to hear from you. And so Nancy and I both said something about Tupper Lake, and I know Nancy, you vacationed there.
I didn't. I restrained myself.
So the fact is, the project was born in the small town of Tupper Lake, New York. I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, when we were vacationing in the Adirondacks and had the AAA guidebook, which as we were driving, we're just about to cross into Tupper Lake. The guidebook said the only tourist attraction in Tupper Lake is a restored synagogue known as the Peddlers' Shoal. So I thought, well, obviously we're going to stop here. And besides the fact there's a fascinating story about a community that has restored this very beautiful gem-like synagogue, and it's maintained primarily by the town. There are very few Jews, if any, left in Tupper Lake. But the docent started telling the story of the founding of this synagogue, and even though she called Lithuania Lithonia, and my daughter did kick me and say, "Don't correct her," which I wasn't going to do. And I was listening to her, and I thought, this can't have happened just here. And she'd tell the story about these Lithuanian Jewish men who had come to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. Some of them left their wives and children in Europe. Others brought their families to the United States but left them in New York City. And the men came up to Tupper Lake and peddled to the logging camps and to the farm families during the week. And on the weekend came back to Tupper Lake, where there were already a few Jewish shopkeepers, who I found out were their suppliers and wholesalers. And one by one, as they saved enough money, they called for their families and built a sort of retail infrastructure to the town. Primarily, she said that all of the dry goods and women's and men's clothing stores in Tupper Lake were all owned by these former peddlers. And by the 1930s, kind of like in the Amazon, one of them is now the mayor of Tupper Lake. And so again, without asking her any questions, thought, this didn't happen just here. And so it was really that kind of happenstance of vacationing that brought me to this. So very quickly, I was very eager that this not be a story about the most successful of these, and the Guggenheims are here, and the Lehmans, and the Zollickmans, and all the famous ones. And I do believe I got a Guggenheim because of that. I'd applied too many times and not gotten it, and somehow when there was a Peddler project, I did. But rather, they were the exceptions. And rather, most of these men and their families ended up as small retail operators, owners of junkyards, of peddler warehouses. And it seemed to me that was the real story, and not the fact that we all walk around with blue jeans with the name Levi's on the back for Levi Strauss, who'd also been a peddler. And so I really continue to be very committed to the social history mode, but to erase that boundary between social history as the history of and please accept this as just a shorthand to move the conversation on, the downtrodden, rather, but also social history as the history of people who find ways to take their destiny in their control, and to see opportunities when they could. And obviously it had to be the right time, the right place. They had to be who they were. People frequently say, well, how come only Jews did this? And besides the fact that it wasn't only Jews who did it, there were large numbers of Arab peddlers in the United States, and actually not just the United States, in South Africa and England and Latin America. And it would make a wonderful comparative study for somebody to look at the Arab and Jewish peddlers and see what differences. And there were the Yankee peddlers, there were some Germans who peddled, some Irish, but it was a distinctive element in the Jewish, in modern Jewish history. And I wanted to, again, race that boundary between history of people who faced obstacles and couldn't make it, and those who could under the right circumstances. I've historically been interested in the history of contact between people who are different. So my very first book was about Jews and blacks in the early part of the 20th century. And like, how did they meet each other? And what did that mean? And while I would probably now collect all the copies of that book and kind of burn them, only because obviously I wouldn't write it the way I did then, it remains a constant concern for me. And how this humble retail experience, this experience of crossing the threshold into someone's home who's utterly different than you. Okay? The person could be a Cherokee Indian, a Mayan farmer, a Swedish Coleman. How does that crossing the threshold with a pack of goods erase difference and, in essence, validate difference? The difference is not something bad, but something that becomes a bond between people. So I went into this with 3 goals. I wanted to know how the nature of the occupation, having to knock on somebody's door and say in a language you don't know, English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Cherokee, Mayan, Welsh, good morning, ma'am, would you like to look at my bag? Okay, so how did that shape this massive migration, which I think Nancy very eloquently said was really one of the most profound phenomenon of modern Jewish history? Okay, and that we can almost contemplate what would have happened, what that history would have been had these people not left. Okay, very different kind of story. Secondly, how did again that nature of the occupation shape Jewish integration into all these new worlds? Okay, and how did it change them? How did it make them very different people than the ones that than when they had left? So I'll end this with an anecdote, and it's one of the stories I love best from the book, and it comes from the Dakotas, and a Lithuanian Jewish peddler, or Lithuanian Jewish peddler, who peddled primarily among German immigrants, German farmers, and they knew him to be a very religious man because he had slept in their home, he wouldn't eat their food, they had seen him pray. And several of the customers approached him and said, look, maybe you can help us, we have a problem. So what was the problem? He said their minister had died, okay, and there was nobody to lead their services on Sunday morning. He said, would you come and be our preacher? And so in the memoir, which was dictated by him through his daughter, and obviously we always have to take these with some degree of skepticism, said he, for several months, every Sunday, he went to this German-speaking church, speaking, as he said, a Yiddish devoid of Hebrew, but therefore was credible, was understandable to German speakers. Every Sunday for several months, he came to their church, and he led them in a discussion of the Torah portion of the week. And so the question I asked myself is, would he, had he stayed in Lithuania, ever entered a church, let alone ascended to the pulpit and discussed the Torah portion? He was very proud that he had taught them about the religious commentator Rashi. And so would he have spoken to Rashi, about Rashi, to a group of Christians? And on the other hand, and here's something Andrew talked about, how it changed them, had they not left and met him, would they have ever had a Jew preach to them? So I'm going to end
Well,
it
you
with
have to
that.
tell them what they called him.
They called him Holy Moses. His name was Moses Zeev, and so they called him Holy Moses. So I'm going to end it with that, and thank you. First thank Nancy and Andrew and Barbara.
Thank you, Professor. It sounds great. I'll get to it immediately. I haven't got the book yet, but I'm on it. I guess with this comparative element, I think that's very interesting, and also comparative with other peddlers, but also a comparison with other migratory laborers who might be strictly in the proletariat, and I'll put that in quotations and leave it controversial, but lumberjacks, coal miners, and so a comparison with that, and I was thinking about Frank Higby's book and this idea of a ethic of mutuality of workers on the road. And I'm just curious if you did see that. Were the peddlers competitors, or was there some sort of solidarity between them and between themselves and also with the consumers? Was there a sense of maybe what you could loosely call a moral economy where prices and other sort of ways of exchange where it could be mediated based on other sorts of values, and sort of maybe a moral economy of what these peddlers might have?
Okay, I think that's a great question. So, for one thing, they did not compete with each other because they couldn't, because they all operated out of a relatively small number of wholesalers. Okay, and they were given a territory, and because the wholesaler didn't want them sort of butting on each other's turf, but rather the wholesaler said, "You go here, you go here, you go here." They reunite over the weekend when they come back from their selling trips, but they don't compete with each other. So on that level, there is a kind of moral universe, but it's a moral universe in part shaped by their linkage to the wholesaler. Okay, and if they violated the norms, the wholesaler had the power in his hand to cut them out. Okay, so but on the other hand, I think your question is the even more important part of your question is their sense of connectedness to their customers, and these are primarily female customers. And yes, I mean they're really they see themselves as I mean, obviously their goal is to make money. I mean, they're not civil rights activists. They're not. They don't come with an ideology about trying to bring people together, but they see that. Entering into these kinds of relationships with the customers and giving them a fair deal, giving them goods that that at a lower price than the local store, help them integrate, help them first to make sales. I found some of the most interesting material where peddlers would sell in areas that had company stores. Okay, and plantations where the owner would often, sort of sugarcane plantations, coffee plantations, and so on. They could, in a sense, by buying from them, the customer could elude or could circumvent the oppressive power of the company store, and so it behooved the peddler to be nicer, sell at a lower price, give better quality goods, which you could define as your moral economy, although, again, their goal is to make a sale.
I wonder if you can talk a little more about, especially considering all these labor history questions that have been raised, about the relationship between the peddlers and these wholesalers. Mm-hmm. How would you conceptualize that in these terms?
Okay, so the peddler is an independent entrepreneur in the sense that he's not an employee of the wholesaler. He gets his goods from the wholesaler. He has to pay the wholesaler back. He has to go where the wholesaler tells him. But he can diversify his good. He could diversify his goods. He could get goods from another wholesaler as well. So he's both the creature of the wholesaler and independent at the same time. The peddlers and the wholesalers depend on them, by the way, just as much. So the wholesaler wants to get goods out to as many different people, and there are many potential customers who are beyond the reach of the store. So the dependence went both ways.
When I first heard you said you were going to write a book about peddlers, you don't know this, but I had written something in which there were peddlers, and it never occurred to me that they had any significance. And there are certain kind of new ideas and arguments that come out in historical writing that once they're out, you think, well, of course, why didn't anybody do this before? And that's what I think about this whole topic, that it's extremely central. But I just want to, and also partly because I'm not having read the book, but I'm learning a lot from these great comments. I want to try another thing and see if you think it's right, which is that in the history of buying consumer goods, if you start with barter and you go through peddling and then you go through retail sales, one of the things that we know is that the degree of personal contact and intercourse and communication is receding.
Yeah.
I mean, in the next stage after peddlers, in small retail stores, you still talk to the shopkeeper a lot, and the shopkeeper has all the news, and you have to tell him what you want, and they take it off the shelf, and then gradually you move into stores with plate glass windows where you see. And so it seems to me that this is a very important aspect of the development of capitalism, from a very personal relationship to the other Amazon,
Right.
where you just click
Right.
to buy something. I don't know if that makes sense, and if you
Absolutely.
explain that.
And so they developed very positive relations with the customers. Some of them leading to marriage, and where there were, Nancy alluded to the chapter called Road Rage, and it was about all of anti-peddler action that took place all over the world. And these were usually local shopkeepers who hated the peddlers because the peddlers could undersell them, or it was the owners of the company's store who also didn't want to lose their business. And by and large, where we have documentation, the customers stood by the peddlers and they preferred them, and they liked that interaction. And in a sense, one testimony after another. And as you can imagine, these are utterly scattered in thousands of places, and this is a project that could not have been done without the internet and without the Hathi Trust and so on. But where that documentation exists, it was about how much these women, in particular, liked that personal connection to the peddler. And so, every time I order anything online, I do have a kind of sense that this is really not. This is kind of inhumane. But I still do it.
I just want to add one thing, that in this tiny way where I saw peddlers, I saw them going to homes that not very many people went there because they were really long distances from each other. There's a real important social nexus there.
Absolutely. I mean, there's basically no place they wouldn't go. I mean, wherever there was a potential customer, they went.
So to follow up a little bit on what Linda just said, would it be accurate at all to see peddling as the commercial equivalent of the putting out system for industry? Where you have a merchant capitalist who needs somewhat independent contractors to, in the case of the textile industry, to spin and weave, and then they give the stuff back to the merchant who handles the larger commerce. And so, I mean, would that be in terms of thinking about the history of capitalism? Would that be one way of thinking about what peddling was?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't made that analogy or hadn't thought of it in that terms. I think you can make a case that there's again that very close relationship between the jobber, as it were, and the people who are doing the actual work, or the contractor. If it's he, usually it was, also crossed the threshold into the workers' homes to bring the bundles or to bring the. I mean, my guess, if one was going to do this, is that the peddler-customer relationship was way less oppressive because the customer, and this is what one of the sort of, thinking about the implications of this, the customer always had the right to slam the door in the peddler's face and say, "Don't come in."
I was thinking more about the relationship between the peddler and the wholesaler.
Oh, and the wholesaler.
Yeah.
Okay,
Being
yeah.
analogous to the relationship between the spinner or the weaver
Yes.
and the merchant who provides the raw material and then pays by the
Yeah. So and now again, I think it's compelling. The peddler, however, can do other kinds of activities at the same time. So it was very common that when peddlers graduated from selling by foot to having a wagon, they began to expand. They certainly expanded their geographic scope, but they also began to become scavengers. So that is in their circuit through the countryside, they would collect rags, bones, feathers, herbs, scrap paper. Sometimes they would enlist the women to do it with them, and they would pay the women for their collecting activities. So they're connected to the wholesaler, and yes, they have to pay him back. But meanwhile, they have a side business. And I don't know if the workers in these little, had that opportunity.
Also, so many of your peddlers will end up being retailers and wholesalers, whereas very, very few of the people in the putting out system will become manufacturers
But it's a really scintillating possibility.
Then just another question, a little bit about the economic history of it. I mean, I imagine how people must have varied like crazy, but do you have good information about how much money peddlers made and how it compares with, say, what a factory worker made or a shopkeeper made?
Okay, so the only information, and it's certainly not hard, is I went to the records of Jewish charities, and where they gave the occupation of the people receiving assistance, what were their occupations, and yet there you found factory workers, and there you found, in fact, street peddlers. The folks who, the push carts, and they were the ones who were getting aid, but you don't see on-the-road peddlers as the recipients of charity. And I found a lot of this was ultimately biographical, and again, like the obituaries that came out on things like the Hathi Frost were phenomenal, but lots of stories of people who were industrial laborers who just found they couldn't, they weren't getting very far. So they said, okay, I guess I'm going to go out peddling. And so the most famous story is the couple that founded I. Magnin, one of these really high-end department stores in San Francisco. So the husband was he made picture frames in some kind of workshop, and he seemed to be not very successful. And his wife says to him, what, the only way you're going to make something of yourself is if you go out and peddle. Okay, and then she's, by the way, who founds iMagnin. It's her store, not his. So that it seemed to be a relatively successul enterprise. Again, most of them don't become Guggenheim or Magnin, but most of them become, a family that owns, a small retail store in, Duma, Arkansas, and gets an obituary, that said, he peddled for 2 years, then he opened his first store, and 3 years later he opened his second store, and later on served on the Water Commission or on the Road Commission, and becomes a Mason, and he'll say his children don't become peddlers after that.
I appreciate there's no way of knowing with any accuracy how many people we're talking about. But can you say, at the peak of the phenomenon, are we talking of hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of people on the road?
Oh, I'd say hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
Oh, absolutely. And so small, communities in the United States and elsewhere, that is Jewish communities, that left some kind of narrative, of either portraits at a moment in time, the 1860s or the 1870s, or historical studies using local records, you'd say 90% of the men peddled, 80% of the men peddled. There's some really good research, particularly done by Cormac O'Grada on the Jews of Ireland. And so basically every man, a couple of thousand Jews from Lithuania came to Ireland. So every man peddled at some time or another. Same thing was true in South Africa. But I'm not going to give you numbers, but I think hundreds of thousands, maybe, multiple hundreds of thousands is what we're talking about.
So maybe we can take one more question.
I was wondering, thinking about the story about the synagogue in the village in the Adirondacks, and then the story about the out in the Dakotas with the Germans in the church, and whether there was something in the nature of the Mosaic experience of these people, that something about the encounter with the stranger and the need to be open to the stranger that comes out of that experience, especially in Eastern European Judaism, that helped them or affirmed them in the process of being peddlers. In other words, they're all operating in a world where everyone is a kind of a stranger in a strange land, and that was something that they took back with them as part of their religious understanding of what they were doing in the new world.
Right. I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think it was very instrumental. It's like they saw this as the fastest road to economic stability, coming to occupy a position where they didn't feel in a way like Agnon's peddler, where their otherness was not necessarily a liability. I'm not sure I want to attribute anything to their religion, although it's notable, and perhaps they had no choice, that they had to be open about who they were because they were so radically different than the person, the person who opened the door. And they couldn't pretend to be a local because here they barely have the language, and so they must acknowledge their identities.
If I can just piggyback, I think actually it's backwards the way you asked the question. I think the big question is who left and why, and that's very, very complicated to get at. But we have to we have to honor that, meaning not everyone left. Lots of people did leave, but probably the young men who left were ready to leave either because they felt economically constrained or they felt other kinds of constraints. And when they made that trip, it was revolutionary because they encountered this new world and could encounter an openness in many cases that they couldn't have back home because their difference back home was a liability. That is why migration to the New World was so formidably, such a transformation for Jews. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Okay, well, I invite all of you to step in the next room and have some wine and continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.